What is non-duality? The death example. Maybe you have heard that non-duality cannot be explained, but today we are not going to look at non-duality and what it is from the perspective of knowledge, of trying to explain what it is. We're just going to simply look at what is and what isn't. And so that understanding doesn't come just from the mind, which can be just spinning forever and trying to look for the answers. And about non-duality, it would never understand it because it's just not a domain of understanding. The mind doesn't notice it. And so let's give an example of dying and death. So it's something that a lot of people are very scared about. It's actually the big problem for the self-identity, the eventual expiration. But let's look at it and take that example as an explanation for non-duality and what it really is. So a lot of people imagine or believe that death is the opposite of life and that life is the opposite of death. But that's not true. Life is a non-dual quality. It doesn't have an opposite. It simply is this. I call this magic because it cannot be explained. And then there is death, and its opposite is birth. So you have the duality of death and birth. And because it's a duality, it's always a story. And a story is always an appearance in thought. So both the death and birth are appearances. Only when we think about them. And I know some of you may think, well, what are you talking about? I've seen people dying. Like I have an experience of, seeing, I work in a hospital, whatever it is, we've all had these experiences in our regular day-to-day life. We've all had losing people, or most of us. So this is not what I'm talking about. This magic can look like anything. It can appear as anything to keep you in that story of believing. If you think that you're in control, or if you think that you know something based on memory, it may give you a sense of being in control, but it distances you from what really is. And so here we are just noticing what is and what isn't. And when I say what isn't, it's really just that appearance in thought. And so birth and death can never be experienced. And that's why they bring so much emotion. The death is always bringing a lot of fear. And in fact, every fear there is, or every anxiety there is always connected to that final imaginary deadline. It's imaginary because we have to imagine. I want you to listen to this video really only from direct experience. So let's forget about the world. I may cover this in another video, how the world is always just a projection of your mind. But right now, let's just look into that non-duality, which is here described as life. And whatever you imagine life is not it. It's imagination. And so you may become present to what you imagine life is. And if you are still enough, you may see some images or some thoughts that describe what life is, including, oh, life cannot be described. anything that pops into your mind, just notice. And so the real life actually happens outside of all of the thoughts and imagination. It's just too obvious to think about. The identity is always there to describe it and to label it and to categorize it so it can control it. So it can somehow protect you from that image of that story of dying. And because it's just that identity that lives in that story, the threat of dying and death is only there for the identity, which is not real. But it appears so, and it's so convincing. But what if you, the real you, which has nothing to do with the person or the thought or even the memory of you, was simply this already? With every sound, sensation, that appears, it happens to a specific entity. What if you looked even beyond that? That life just unfolds the way it is. And it's completely meaningless, unreasonable. There is just nothing behind it. But the self-identity is looking for meaning and purpose. And its main agenda is to be a good person. If there was another name for the ego, it would be a good person. It always has good intentions in line with that story, in which there is death at the end of it. And so it does anything to prevent itself from dying. Its only purpose is to survive. When you look at the word survive, it sounds like survive, like outlive this moment. It's not interested in living. It's already dead. That's why once you see through it, the illusion is just it's just hilarious. It's like the final, the ultimate joke. Like you see a ghost being so scared of dying. We just cannot be with life when that story is present. We don't even notice life. It's hidden, it's obscured, even though it's all that you are. Even with all its dualities. So, what is non-duality? It's magic. And any attempt to try to understand it logically, obviously, will fail. But when you look beyond that, just being with that, life, how can you explain that? Sure, there are so many theories and scientific theories, and they are so good, some of them. They're so convincing. There was always going to be a problem with all of them. Because the truth is, life is not coming from anywhere and it's not going anywhere. It's all there is. And because it's so devoid of meaning, devoid of entertainment, it has to come up with some stories, with some illusion that appears so real that tricks itself into believing that there is a separate person who is separate from everything else, and experiencing this life, imagining that there is going to be the end of it. And so I have a limited time here. And all your stress, all the pressure comes from that illusion that I have a limited time here. But what you really are is completely timeless. Because it's just this, life. And I say just as if there was something else, as if, oh, life is just this, and the whole other show and the really important things are happening in thought. But the thought is the illusion. So, what would you be without imagination? If you could not imagine the past and the future? What would you do, or what would you notice? What would you be without your memories? It's like, how do you know they are even yours? It's an image appearing. It can be anything. Anything. But it appears as what it appears as, in its perfection, to sometimes take your attention away from your true nature into believing that you are a small, separate person who has to do so much in here in order to survive. Not just physically, but mostly symbolically. And without all of these stories, without the need to survive, to bypass this moment, to find some better experience in the future, it's just this magic, complete magic, with no explanation, with nowhere to go, with nowhere to having come from. You were never born, and you're never gonna die. It's always just a thought, an image that chose you to keep you in that story. And there is also nothing wrong with it. It gives life meaning, purpose, beautiful stories, adventures. It's thrilling. And it's nothing.